Welcome to Quilter's Architect. My name is Mark, and in this video, I'm introducing my latest quilt pattern, pop beads. With this quilt pattern, you might think back to when you were a kid. I was discussing this with Sherry, and we talked about how, as kids, we used to have those pop beads, and you could assemble them into different things. They had a lot of different colors. Sherry said that she would often make bracelets and necklaces from the pop beads. And then she really enjoyed the fact that with all the different colors, then you could rearrange and make, a variety of different looks with the different color combinations. This pattern has this snowball type block, and then it has a block that you could call it different things. Sometimes I've seen this called diversional. A lot of people might call it like a spool block because it kind of looks like a spool of thread a little bit. And so those two blocks are the blocks in the quilt alternating with different fabric combinations. We went and looked at our stash, and we were looking at the colors that we have kind of, that we assigned to the quilt pattern. And this has like a variation of grays, like smoke, silver, and charcoal. We went to look to see what do we have in our stash. Actually, what we found is we didn't have any silver, anything we could really fit into this color. We did have something we could align to the smoke color, so this was ideal for that. We didn't really have a charcoal. And so, black, charcoal is kind of black. There's variations on that. It can be less dark than black, of course. But we're just going to go with a black fabric, a plain black fabric for the charcoal. That covers the spool block that has the three combinations of smoke, silver, and charcoal. And then the other variation on this diversional block or spool block is you'll notice we have like a wine, a magenta, and the silver. We were looking in the fabric stash, and what we notice is we have some Tula pink. And this Tula pink has another theme that's kind of near and dear to my heart. It has cats on it. From the time that I was a little kid, we always had cats. My mom has always had a big thing for cats. When she was a little girl, her mother would never let her have a cat. They always liked dogs. So when she finally got on her own, she always had cats. Up until, her passing, she had cats either outside or inside the house. We thought this would be a nice combination, these two Tula pink fabrics, for aligning to the wine and magenta that I have assigned to the other spool block or diversional block. It has the darker color in the center and then the other color on the outside. Now in our case, we were thinking this really would be ideal for the center, the center square of the diversional or spool block. And then we would put this on the stitch and flip corners. So these would be together in those blocks. You can see that on the pattern looking at the other variation of fabrics for the spool block or diversional block, that it has the two wine and magenta and then the silver. This silver would be the fabric on each side of the spool, and then this would be in the middle of the spool, and this would be at the top and bottom of the spool. Moving on to the snowball blocks, we notice looking at those that these have, we have a couple of variations of what I called in here, I think lagoon and meadow are the two colors I assigned to this. And so we also have some Tula pink that aligns well to this. And what we were thinking for the middle of the snowball block, this is another Tula pink that has cats on it. They're smaller cats than the other fabric. And so this would be in the middle of that snowball. And then when we do our stitch and flip on the corner, each corner of the snowball, this would be the outside corners of the snowball block. You notice that in the pattern we have our white snowball blocks, and those have the outside corners with the stitch and flip in the silver fabric again. We can see that these two will complement each other for those snowball blocks. For the border of the quilt, I have a combination of strips and blocks. So blocks on the corners and distributed in the middle of each border. And so I did a combination of several colors of these fabrics to form the borders in the pattern. Back to the Tula pink fabric with the cats. If you like cats, you probably have a cat story or two. Cats are a lot of fun, and they can be, I think, more affectionate sometimes than dogs. I don't know, it's a hard call. Sometimes dogs can be affectionate and sometimes not as much. But cats also can be very aloof, right? They're kind of, when they want the attention, they want it. Sometimes they just want to be alone. But the stories I thought of with cats were, I've had a lot of cats down through the years. And I remember one time we lived in a small house. We had a backyard that was fenced in, and the cats got out of control. I guess because mom liked cats so much. I think it was my dad who finally decided he had to do something. There were so many cats. I don't know if it was him or if it was a neighbor, but someone called the pound. And the pound came, and they came to get like the abundance of cats out of there. Out of all the kittens that there was one that was like my kitten. I took that kitten and I opened a window. I opened the kitchen window because we had screens in our windows. And I put that kitten between the window and the screen. And I shut the window down so he couldn't get out. Well, being a child, I don't remember if I was probably 5 or 6, 7 years old, something like that. I forgot about the kitten overnight. I don't know if it was the heat or if it was the humidity, but the kitten died. I was like devastated because I was trying to save the kitten from the pound. And you know how that is. Like, I think most of us have that fear about any animal going to the pound because many of them don't survive because there's no one to take them, and the pound, they have a limitation on how many they can keep for a certain amount of time. The other story about cats, when I was looking at this, it made me think of more this fabric because this fabric from the green family colors, it has a darker colored cat. We had a cat named Chester, and that cat, he was in and out of the house. And again, I was a kid. And back then, I don't know if they make refrigerators with a freezer on the bottom now. I think they kind of got away from that. It seems like most are in the top. We had a refrigerator with the freezer on the bottom. I let that cat, I don't really know why the cat would get in the freezer. I don't know if it smelled meat in there, like in a package, but the cat got in the freezer. I guess I had opened the door to get something out. The cat had gotten in the freezer and I closed the door. So that cat was in there for a few minutes. It wasn't long enough to kill it. So boy, I'm really glad of that. But when he came out of there, he was definitely, you could tell he was like, he seemed lethargic, like he actually had started to get so cold that he couldn't move very good. But I really got a what for my mom for that because she loved that black, it was a black cat and she loved that cat. So those are my cat stories. One was tragic and one was nearly tragic, but I've always enjoyed having cats around. We don't have any right now, but I think one for us right now, one pet is enough. We have Blue, our dog. But anyways, with that history of always having cats around our family, we're going to feature these Tula pink fabrics in this quilt. And I'm looking forward to seeing what this looks like. When I designed the quilt pattern, I didn't realize that we were gonna end up choosing this Tula pink fabric. So I didn't assign that fabric to the actual, visual appearance of the quilt in the pattern itself. And of course, I don't even know, most people may not have these Tula pink fabrics. They may have something else that they prefer to use. Given that a lot of people are not going to have the same fabric in their stash, or they may not want to buy fabric for a pattern. It's really not always that important, I guess, that, the fabric you're going to use is represented in the pattern. But if you do have some Tula pink fabric around and you have these fabrics, it might be a really nice combination to make this quilt with. One thing I noticed when I was putting this quilt pattern together is the way the blocks line up. It's interesting that although on the corners of the blocks we'll have points to align, it's interesting that since the silver fabric is on the sides of the spool blocks and it's also on the corners of some of the snowball blocks, we don't have nearly as many points to line up when we're putting our blocks together. So this is a case of a pattern that may give us a little bit of a break on after we get all our blocks assembled and we start assembling our rows, having to line up so many points as we're assembling, like 4 patches in 2 rows within our quilt. I'm really looking forward to seeing the final quilt finish, and I'm going to enjoy making it. I hope you'll join me and make this quilt as well, and I hope you find some awesome fabric from your stash so that you can go ahead and use something you already have. So let's take a minute to talk about the fabric requirements. And so looking at page 2 of our quilt pattern, for the fabric I labeled as smoke, we need 1 7/8 yards, and for the fabric labeled as silver, we need 2 3/4 yards. And for the fabric that I'm calling in the pattern charcoal, we need a 7/8 yards. For the fabric that I called Lagoon, which would be this fabric in the fabrics that I chose, we're going to need 7/8 yard. And then for the fabric that I'm calling Meadow, which in my case is this Tula pink fabric, we need 1 3/4 yards. For the fabric that I'm calling Magenta in the pattern, we need 7/8 yards. For the fabric labeled as Wine in the pattern, we need 1/2 yard. And then finally, for the center of some of our snowball blocks, white, we need 1 1/2 yards. And of course, some of these fabrics will be reused in the border, and those also play into the fabric requirements. If you look at the description of this video, you'll see that I have a link to the quilt pattern. So you can easily download that. You'll have a PDF version of it. You might be someone who likes to use it on your tablet or print it, and then you can follow along with me and make this quilt. I hope you do. Also on page 2 of the quilt pattern, I wanted to show you under cutting instructions for each of the fabric pieces that we're going to include in the quilt. I have a column here to the right, and it's how many strips to cut. This is making the assumption that you have width of fabric that gives you at least around 42 inches of usable fabric once you remove the selvage. If you look at that column, you'll notice, like using fabric piece A as an example, I need a quantity of 42 9.5 by 2 3/4 inch rectangles. And so it's telling us that we need to cut 11 strips of 2 3/4 inch. So this tells us the number of strips we would cut, and then we would cut those strips into the rectangle size that's listed in the column size. So this makes it kind of easy just to look at this page, see how many strips do we need to cut, and then once we get our strips cut, we can cut all those strips into the actual fabric piece size. And of course, before I do my cutting, I'm going to do a little bit of ironing because, you know, with these, some of these wrinkles wouldn't affect the cutting accuracy, but some could. So just going to do a little bit of pre-ironing. We had a cat one time named Lacey, but that cat, it got to where it knew the sound of my car. And so I would come home. I was working at Keller Manufacturing back then, which is no longer in business. It was a furniture factory. And that cat, it really liked me a lot. It's probably the only cat I've ever had that liked me that much. But Sherry said that, so that street that we lived on, I would say that from turning onto the road from the main road to drive back to the house, there are probably about 6 or 7 houses between the turnoff of the main road and our house. And Sherry said that cat evidently could hear the car. Like it could, I don't know if it was hearing the wheels, the engine, or the transmission, but that cat would run when I was coming down the road. And she said it had to be as I was turning in the road because it was a little bit before I got there. It wasn't like right as I was pulling in the driveway. It was, like enough time that I would have to still drive down the street. And that cat would run from the other part of the house and jump up in the window waiting to see me pull up in the car. It's the only cat I've ever had that, had a behavior like that, where it seemed to look forward to someone coming home, as well as, I know all animals seem to be happy when you come home, but it's kind of like this cat was anticipating my arrival each day. I did give it a lot of attention, but that cat would run and get in the window and sit there and watch and wait for me to pull in. I guess it was something about the sound of the car. It wasn't like real loud. I didn't have like a muscle car or anything at that time. It was probably like a Toyota. I think it was a Toyota truck or a Toyota Camry, something like that. But that cat knew the sound, and that cat was there waiting for me when I got home. So I don't know if other people have had similar experiences, but that was a cool cat. And then that cat finally, when she was older, she got this condition where I don't know if it's like something with if they have eustachian tubes like humans. I can't remember what the explanation was, but it's kind of like vertigo or dizziness or something like that. And when we moved, we couldn't take the cat where we were going, but we found a new owner, and I was really surprised somebody was willing to take her because she would go in circles. Sometimes, she got to where, because of that dizziness, she was walking in circles or kind of just standing going in a circle. But I don't know that I'll ever forget that cat. That was a special cat to recognize, your car when you're coming home and be there waiting for you as soon as you come in the door. So looking at my cutting instructions for the smoke fabric, for the 42 9.5 by 2 3/4 inch rectangles, I need 11 strips of 2 3/4. For fabric piece B, I need 2 strips of 3.5. For fabric piece C, I need 9 strips of 2.5 inch. Now that we have the strips cut for fabric smoke, I'm going to cut 42 9.5 by 2 3/4 inch rectangles from the strips that I cut for fabric piece A. For fabric piece B, we need 4 18.5 by 3.5 inch strips. Fabric piece C is for the binding, and so these are with the fabric by 2.5 inch strips. The only thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and square up the ends, and that way when it comes time to sew those together, they'll already be ready. So this wraps up the cutting of fabric smoke. For fabric piece A, I have 42 of the 9.5 by 2 3/4 inch triangles. For fabric piece B, I have 4 of the 18.5 by 3.5 inch strips. And for fabric piece C, I have 9 strips of 2.5. Moving on to the silver fabric. For fabric piece D, I need 11 strips of 2 3/4. And for fabric piece E, which is to make 5 by 2 3/4 inch rectangles, I need 11 strips also of 2 3/4. For fabric piece F, we're going to have 80 3.5 inch squares. We need 7 strips of 3.5. For fabric piece G, we need 2 strips of 3.5 also. So now that we have our strips cut for the silver fabric, for fabric piece D, we need 164 2 3/4 inch squares from the strips that we cut. With our silver fabric for fabric piece E, we need 82 5 inch by 2 3/4 inch rectangles. So we're using our strips that are 2 3/4 to cut those 5 inch pieces. For fabric piece F, we need 80 3.5 inch squares. So we're going to cut those out of these strips that we cut previously. With our silver fabric for fabric piece G, we need 4 18.5 by 3.5 inch strips. Okay, so for fabric silver and fabric piece D, I have 164 of my 2 3/4 inch squares. I have 82 of my 5 by 2 3/4 inch rectangles, and I have 80 3.5 inch squares, and I have 4 18.5 by 3.5 inch strips. Okay, moving on to our charcoal fabric. For fabric piece H, we need 3 strips of 5 inches. For charcoal fabric piece I, we need 1 strip of 3.5. And for charcoal fabric piece J, we need 2 strips of 3.5. For charcoal fabric piece H, I need to cut 21 5-inch squares for my strips. For charcoal piece I need to cut 4 3.5 inch squares. For charcoal fabric piece J, I need 4 18.5 by 3.5 inch strips. So for charcoal fabric piece H, I have 21 5-inch squares. For charcoal fabric piece I have 4 3.5 inch squares. And for charcoal fabric piece J, I have 4 18.5 by 3.5 inch strips. For lagoon fabric piece K, I need 8 strips of 3.5. For lagoon fabric piece K, we need 88 of the 3.5 inch squares out of the strips we just cut. For the lagoon fabric, I have fabric piece K cut. It's 88 3.5 inch squares. Okay, for the fabric I have labeled in the pattern as meadow, which in my case is this Eula pink cat print. I need 5 strips of 9.5 inches. Now for fabric piece M in the meadow fabric from the pattern, we need 2 strips of 3.5. For meadow fabric piece N, we need 1 strip of 3.5. For meadow fabric piece L, we need 29.5 squares cut from our strips. For meadow fabric piece M, we need 4 18.5 by 3.5 inch strips. For meadow fabric piece N, we need 4 3.5 inch squares. So for the fabric labeled as meadow in the pattern, for fabric piece L, I have 29.5 inch squares. I also have for fabric piece M, 4 18.5 by 3.5 inch strips. And then for fabric piece N, I have 4 3.5 inch squares. For the fabric labeled as magenta in the pattern, but I'm of course using this Tula pink fabric, we're going to need 10 strips at 2 3/4. For fabric piece O of the fabric labeled as magenta in the pattern, we need 40 9.5 by 2 3/4 inch rectangles. Okay, so for magenta fabric piece O, I've cut out 40 of the 9.5 by 2 3/4 inch rectangles. For the fabric labeled as wine in the pattern, for fabric piece P, I need 3 strips of 5 inches. And from the strips we just cut for fabric piece P, we need 20 5-inch squares. For fabric piece P, also labeled as wine in the pattern, I've cut 20 of the 5-inch squares. Okay, down to our final fabric piece, white fabric piece Q. We need 5 strips of 9.5. For the white fabric piece Q, we need 29.5-inch squares. Well, that wraps up the cutting for the pop beads quilt, and in the next video I'm going to go through demonstrating making the snowball blocks as well as the diversional spool blocks. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please leave any comments you'd like to share, as well as give a thumbs up if you enjoyed the video. If you haven't subscribed to my channel and you enjoy videos about sew-alongs and also receiving free quilt patterns, I encourage you to subscribe to my channel. Until the next video, I'm wishing you happy sewing and beautiful finishes.